Hi everybody, welcome to lesson 3 of our resource management unit. In our last lesson, which for some of you was a live lesson, we were looking at demand for food in the UK. Today we're looking at our second main energy resource, which is demand for water, and the next lesson we'll be looking at the demand for energy. So before we kick off, there are going to be two main terms that I think you need to understand before we carry on with the rest of the lesson. The first one is something called a water deficit. Now, a water deficit is an area which does not have enough water for the needs of the population, and a water surplus is an area that has more water than the need for the population. So, for example, if an area has 100 people and enough water for 80 people, they're in a water deficit. Whereas if an area has enough water for 500 people but only has 100 people, they are in a water surplus. And those two words are quite important to understanding some of the issues that are taking place in the UK right now. And those issues are going to be quite clearly identified on this first set of maps. So, figure 2 is showing UK rainfall distribution. Okay, so figure 2 is showing UK rainfall distribution. And on my map, I can see that the places with the largest amount of rain are in the dark blue. So this area of Scotland here, this area of the northwest near where we are, and this area of North Wales here. Again, there should be no surprise, but all these three areas are very highland areas because a lot of the main rainfall occurs next to areas of high land. In contrast, the areas that are in the dark brown are areas where there is a very, very low amount of water, or a much, much, much lower amount of water in those areas. So, for example, in the southeast around here, we are getting some places that only have less than 600 millimeters of rainfall on average in a year. Whereas if I was in the northwest over here, St Helens, of course, located in this region, we would be having 1,500 to 3,000 millimeters on average. Now, that is quite a big difference. And that becomes important when we start to look at figure 3, which is the UK population density. Now, the population density is essentially how many people are living in a small space of land. And if we look at this map, the areas that are darker show the highest population density. So, for example, we've got London down here. We've got Liverpool, we've got Manchester, we've got Birmingham, and all those places, the big cities, they are areas of high population density. Now let's think back to our definitions at the very start of this lesson. Can you see any problems that might arise if we were to overlap these two maps? So if I was to put figure 2 on top of figure 3 and we could see the patterns on both, what might be some problems? Well, the first problem that I can see is that if we take this whole southeast region here, we've got a very, very low amount of rain. Whereas over here, we've got a very, very high population density. Now, that suggests to me that in those areas, we might have a water deficit. So it might be the case that in that part of the UK, there is a water deficit. However, in contrast, up in the north of Scotland, we've got areas with an average of 300 millimetres of rain. In the areas in the north up here with over 300 millimetres of rain, over this side, we've got an area that has a very low population density. So then maybe that area would have a water surplus. Okay, so if we were going to do an exam style question on this, it would say as follows. It would say, describe the distribution of areas of water surplus and water deficit in the UK using figure 2 and figure 3. I'd like to have a little go at this question, and you don't have to write it in full sentences, but I'd like to have a think about the structure, what you might have to include, and any keywords you can use as well. So when you're describing it, what I would do is I would take maybe 2 or 3 regions of the UK, for example, the north, the southeast, and maybe the central region. Talk about what's happening in each one, and then give it an answer. So pause this video and have a little go. in a second. Okay, so what can the UK do to prevent water stress in some areas? Well, in order to kind of combat that problem of water surplus and water deficit, we are in the UK creating something called a water transfer scheme. Now, what the UK government wanted to do, what they considered, was setting up a national water grid, similar to the one we had for electricity, which would flow water from areas of surplus, such as Wales, to areas of deficit, such as London. However, it's never been fully put into practice because imagine the enormous costs involved with actually doing that. There are concerns involving the impact on the environment, dams being constructed to create reservoirs, local carbon emissions increasing, potential droughts in the river source, etc. However, the reservoirs in the mountainous areas of North Wales can provide water already for places like Liverpool and Manchester. So a lot of the water that you guys and me will be drinking and having access to will have already flown from North Wales. We've got some sort of North water transfer already in place. But obviously, geographically speaking, North Wales is much, much closer than those other areas. And the water from the Kielder Dam in Northumberland is pumped into the North Tyne River. From there, it can be transferred to 3 major other rivers. So the northeast of England also has a similar project. Now, on paper, this would solve the problem. But as anything, the issues are that the costs involved in that sort of project are absolutely astronomical. They're really, really big. And doing it, there's no guarantee that it would even work. Because the problem with water is that unlike electricity, or unlike food, or I guess food has it a little bit, but unlike electricity in particular, you can't just transfer water and expect it to be perfect every single time. Because in reality, is all water clean and safe to use? Because we turn on our taps and kind of take for granted this idea that water is safe, that we can use it. But actually, if it was being pumped for hundreds of miles through pipes underground, would it still be safe if it then got to London? And that causes, we actually have a lot of water pollution. So in the UK, only about 27% of our water is classified as being of a good status under the EU water framework, which is absolutely insane when you think about it. Okay, so you can read through the factors on the slide there. But our water is polluted from things like runoff from roads and motorways, chemicals from farming, untreated waste, sewage, pollution from boats and ships, rubbish like putting trolleys and bikes being dumped in the rivers as well. And all of that means that our waters are being polluted. That means 73% of our water in the UK could be polluted or of poor quality. So when talking about these water transfer schemes, that would make this issue worse, and also means that the water that we have isn't even safe some of the time. And that makes it quite difficult when we're thinking about a water surplus, because just because we have the amount of water doesn't necessarily mean that that water is safe to use and good to use. And that affects us. It increases water temperature, which can lead to the death of wildlife habitats. The drinking water can be poisoned. Pesticides can kill important parts of the ecosystem. And in terms of wildlife itself, the impact could be huge. And take this for example, people whose livelihoods depend on clean water supply, like fishermen or workers in the tourist industry, might suffer. If you work in an area which has outstanding natural beauty, and the rivers and the lakes are the reason you are getting that tourism, if that was then removed or reduced, you would have some serious problems moving forward. So obviously, water pollution does affect us in the UK, and it does cause some pretty serious problems as well. So, because of that, there are obviously ways in which water is managed in the UK. So, there are on the slide here, there are 6 different reasons, and they are as follows. We've got education campaigns, and these inform the public about the damage being caused by putting inappropriate items into the sewage systems like engine oil and baby wipes, and advise of how to do it correctly. We've got things called pollution traps. When new motorways are built, they build them that kind of catch the pollution before it ends up in the water. We've built these things called green roofs and walls, which naturally filter out pollutants in the rainwater. If you remember looking at BedZ in year 10, that had a huge green roof on it, and partly of that was the CO2 emissions, but the other part was that it enables that water to be filtered naturally so that it would be cleaner when it came out, so less polluted. Better treatment plants, so better plants actually turn that sewage into drinking water. So Thames Water in London is investing heavily in its sewage works and new tunnels to prevent overflow. More water treatment centres, and also something called legislation as well. Now, legislation is another word for the laws that are in place that enable water companies to provide drinking water. There's very clear regulations and penalties. So, for example, if United Utilities, the water company, provide water that is of a certain level of pollution, they face a financial penalty or a fine or even losing contracts. So that encourages them to manage that water as well as they can. If, for example, a sewer is not being run properly, there is legislation which means that that has to be sorted out. It has to be made better. There's financial penalties in place, and that kind of enables us to make sure our water quality remains as good as it can possibly be. So, on that thing, there's quite a lot of information on those slides. So, what I'd like you to do is you can go back through this video to have a look, but there are 3 questions. Why are water transport systems needed in the UK? That is the first slide with the 2 maps to answer that question. Outline 3 causes of water pollution in the UK and explain 2 ways water quality is managed in the UK. To do those questions, you're going to need to go back through this PowerPoint or this video, and then I'd like you to upload those answers to those questions to show my homework, and we can go from there.